It's my privilege now to introduce to you Miss Sue Horan. She's been engaged this year on a doctoral project, but on crime in South Australia, but she was awarded first class honours in the University Medal in History last year here at Flinders after she completed a BA thesis on prostitution in South Australia in the 19th century, and it's a part of that study that she's going to tell us about this afternoon. She tells me that Kay Daniels, isn't it? Kay Daniels is putting together a book which Fontana will publish in due course on prostitution in Australia, and some, at least, of her work will appear in that publication. It's fairly obvious, I think, that workers, destitute, prostitutes, the group of, and indeed the Aborigines that Robert will speak about later in the afternoon, we're looking at a group of subject people within the colony. It's a fairly gloomy picture that's emerging of life in South Australia. There must have been some pleasant, lighter moments. I can't think of any for the moment. We'll actually ask Ron Gibbs later. But anyway, with those introductory remarks, Sue Horan.
The focus of the paper is on the experiences of the prostitutes themselves, as far as that's obtainable from the records, as well as on the responses of the remainder of the society to these women. Despite the intentions of the founders of South Australia, it is clear that prostitution developed very early. Although there are numerous broad acknowledgements of what was seen as a prostitution problem throughout this period, nevertheless, it is necessary to turn to police statistics for any examination of the numbers of prostitutes in South Australia. Any attempts to interpret such statistics must clearly be pursued with caution. Firstly, it seems clear that the extent of prostitution was subject at least to some degree to the overall fluctuations of employment and trade within the economy. Secondly, the number of convictions does not, of course, indicate the number of prostitutes actually working at any point in time. These numbers are, for example, clearly affected by the changes in police policy and supervision. Similarly, the estimates only relate to those prostitutes known to the police. For, as the Acting Commissioner of Police pointed out in 1881, added to this number were occasional or part-time prostitutes, who included an undefined number of young girls who, quote, reside with their parents and walk the streets in the evening and are virtually prostitutes, many of them during the day in factories and other places. With these limitations in mind, it is possible to gain some impression of the extent of prostitution in South Australia from some of the remaining survey estimates made by the police. And I'll just look at three of these quickly. In 1850, in a series of raids, 96 names were collected, only 10 being from neighbouring colonies. And you got a bit of interchange between colonies of prostitutes coming in. By 1881, it was claimed that within the city of Adelaide and the suburbs of Norwood, Kensington and Hindmarsh, there were 500 known prostitutes. Since the number of adult males for these places was placed at 14,426, this would mean that there was about one prostitute for every 28 adult males at this time. Another estimate in 1892, in a set of estimates made in answer to a request by the government statist, it is possible to gain some idea as to the extent of rural prostitution in South Australia. In Adelaide, there were said to be 208 known prostitutes in the country, and in the country districts of South Australia there were none, except for 10 in Port Adelaide. Although there is little evidence to believe that rural prostitution in South Australia was ever very extensive, nevertheless it does not seem to have been quite so totally absent as these police estimates would indicate. From a study of the registers of admissions to the industrial school as well as the boys and girls reformatories for the years 1863 to 82, for example, it is possible to establish that prostitution was practised in at least some rural areas. Mary H., and I'll just give the initial, that's what I normally do, for instance, was a reputed woman of ill fame at Port Augusta in 1879, her husband having gone to England and her two daughters being admitted to the industrial and reformatory schools. And there's similar examples I came across for Mount Gambier too. In terms of there being any areas where prostitution predominated within the Adelaide city perimeters, East and West Adelaide's can be said to have been what is often referred to as a red light district. This can be demonstrated by an examination of brothels reported in the police files during, in particular, the 1880 to 1914 period. And there's a map of that if anyone wants to have a look at it later. It is important to try to analyse some of the factors which may have induced such a number of women to become prostitutes during this time. In terms of their background, at least some of those who were prostitutes in South Australia had been so before their arrival in the colony. Agnes L.C., for example, known by the police as a common prostitute in 1882, was reported by another prostitute to have been engaged in prostitution in New Zealand for 11 years prior to visiting her parents in England and then coming to live in South Australia. Still others were subjected to the often demoralising influence of a voyage by ship in which immigrants and crews were together in close proximity for extended periods of time. Aligned to this was the fact that procurers were known to board immigrant ships on their arrival in an attempt to augment the numbers of prostitutes in Adelaide. The excess of young single men in the rural areas of South Australia was noted by Dr. Penny in his memorial to Governor Grey in 1842 as being one of the manifest reasons behind prostitution in the colony. Unequal numbers in the sexual ratios may well have been a contributory factor, but as Chris Nance has pointed out, South Australia went closer to realising the goal of equality in the proportions of the sexes than any of the other Australian colonies. Other elements, therefore, may have had a greater impact in terms of the South Australian situation. Some contemporaries pointed to the corrupting influences of the often crowded conditions in factories where young girls and women were employed. Added to this was the influence of the dancing saloons, which were viewed as encouraging and supplying opportunities for early sexual promiscuity. Although this alone would not seem in reality sufficient cause for any number of girls or women entering a life of prostitution, it is reasonable to assume, as Judith and Daniel Walkowitz, if that's how they say their name, emphasised in their study of prostitution in Plymouth and Southampton, that, quote, women who moved into occasional prostitution had had previous sexual experiences, and that for many the distinction between promiscuity and clandestine prostitution may have remained blurred. Inherent in both these factors which may have attracted women to prostitution, that is, factories' influence and dancing saloons, said to me, is the fact that they applied principally to activities which involved the lower classes in society. Thus, they can be seen as pointing to the element of economic necessity as well as economic advantage, which was surely involved in the decision to turn to prostitution during this period. Contemporaries often tended to lay emphasis on this as a cause. For example, Mrs. Frances Maybank Anderson, in her unfortunately titled work in 1917, The Root of the Matter, Social and Economic Aspects of the Sex Problem, identified the lack of sufficient wages for women as a major factor in the choice of many to take, quote, the only way which seemed open. As abundant proof of this, this is getting worse, as abundant proof of this, she pointed to the fact that, quote, only a very few girls from well-provided families become prostitutes. In South Australia, again as Nance points out, in looking at the period up to 1870s, domestic work was one of the few avenues open to women searching for employment. In addition, the wages offered were generally about half of that paid to men. For many then, selling their labour was considerably less lucrative than selling their sexuality, and prostitution, despite its risks, may well have been viewed as being freer and more remunerative than any other alternative occupations, at least to those in the lower classes. Although the choice cannot on the whole be seen in terms of starve or sin, nevertheless economic necessity must be viewed as one fairly important contributory factor in an analysis of the often interdependent causes of prostitution in South Australia during this period. Looking at the different ways in which prostitution was practised in South Australia during this period, there are a number of scattered references in police files to the categories of upper and lower class prostitutes. However, the focus in the police reports tends to be upon cases pertaining to the lower classes of prostitute. This can of course be seen as a function of the different style of operation in which the upper class prostitute was involved, one in which it was seen to be rather more important not to attract the attention of the police and others in authority. In Adelaide, there is considerable evidence, particularly in the police files, concerning the existence of the various types of brothels and houses of assignation, as well as the varying functions performed by the keepers of these places. Perhaps most common was the residential brothel, usually well known to the police and consisting of between 2 and 5 prostitutes, one of whom assumed the title of occupier with the others being listed as residents. This style of brothel can be contrasted with those run by a lodging house keeper, where a room or bed could be hired for a few hours or for the entire night by prostitutes and their clients. Houses of this kind were frequently located in close proximity to the city hotels. One such, kept by Mrs. C, was situated opposite the Shakespeare Hotel in Weymouth Street. Here as many as 40 men were recorded by the police as visiting during a single day. In a similar way, a lodging house kept by a Russian Jewess, she undoubtedly wasn't, but they like to assume titles like that, known as Yetta C, was placed in Hindley Street, 2 doors east of the Adelaide Hotel. However, this particular case can be seen as an instance of a somewhat different kind of brothel lodging house. In addition to being a lodging house, it operated at least nominally as an oyster saloon or restaurant. Here, as it seems, was very commonly the situation in Adelaide brothels. Beer and other kinds of alcohol were offered for sale at all hours. Yetta C, the keeper, had herself been convicted and fined for sly grog selling on different premises in Hindley Street prior to this. Again, as was said to be common in Adelaide brothels, gambling was practised on these premises. This particular case also gives insight into at least one kind of relationship which existed between the keeper of this type of brothel and the prostitutes boarding there. Although a man named N was living with Yetta C, she was clearly the proprietor of the place, charging 6 shillings per night for a double bed in the best room, if that was like, 5 shillings per night for the same in other rooms, and 1 shilling per night for a single bed in a shared room. She can be viewed as a keeper who was making considerable profits from her prostitute lodgers, running the house in a manner calculated to ensure that it was financially viable. As Josephine L, one of the prostitutes who had boarded there for a short while, explained, quote, she, Yetta C, takes the money herself, sometimes at the counter and sometimes upstairs, but always before the use of the room is given. If the money is not paid beforehand, she turns the girls out. On the other hand, looking at the rates charged by some of the prostitutes on this premises, there is the evidence supplied to the police by one of the men frequenting this establishment. Quote, on one occasion he was put to sleep in one of the beds in this 3-bedded room upstairs. There were then 1 girl in one of the beds and 2 in another. The 2 latter told him he could sleep between them for 15 shillings. Such a figure can in turn be seen as yielding fairly substantial earnings to these prostitutes, at least in terms of the rather low-class reputation attributed to these lodgings. Although by far the majority of brothel keepers in Adelaide seem to have been women, married or otherwise, there are a few instances where men were known to have assumed this role. Joseph R, for example, kept a brothel next door to the Royal Oak Hotel in Hindley Street in 1884. At least his role as a brothel keeper was not an ephemeral one. For 20 years later, in 1904, he is seen to enter the police lists of known occupiers of houses of assignation in the eastern sector of the city. This style of house differed from the residential brothel and from the brothel lodging house, and was known variously as the short-term house, or house of assignation. As its names indicate, it provided both the full-time as well as occasional prostitute with a place where she could either accompany or arrange to meet her client, hiring the use of a room for a short time and having her place of residence elsewhere, which had obvious advantages for her. In addition, such houses made it possible for the occupier or keeper of the establishment to act as a form of liaison between the clients and suitable prostitutes, arranging for them to meet on the premises. This form of operation quite clearly lent itself to a more discreet practice of prostitution, and may therefore be regarded as allowing for the needs of a higher class of prostitute than was commonly found in the brothels in many of the city streets. Joseph R, then, as one whose position had changed over a period of 20 years from a brothel keeper in 1884 to the keeper of a house of assignation in 1904, may be viewed as having improved his economic status, at least in terms of the social hierarchy which seems to have existed between prostitutes in Adelaide. Not all brothel or houses of assignation, the keepers of those I should say, seem to have been themselves involved in the practice of prostitution. Instead, it would appear that they opened their homes to use by prostitutes in order to augment their own incomes. Thus, for instance, Mrs. S conducted a house of assignation at her residence on South Terrace in 1897. However, neither she nor her sister, who was living with her, were known to the police as women of ill repute. In addition, her 2 children also shared this house together with her husband, himself a baker and confectioner at a growing bakery firm in Wakefield Street. Without doubt, it seems that the clientele of prostitutes were not restricted to any particular class in South Australia. The very existence of what were viewed as higher and lower class prostitutes must be regarded as a kind of implicit testimony to the economic and social status of those who can be seen as creating the demand for prostitution. It is difficult to discover the proportions of the different classes involved, since, after all, the focus of the police and other authorities implicated in dealing with prostitution as a crime was almost invariably on the only one seen by law to be committing an offence, namely the prostitute herself. There are even greater difficulties, again rather predictably, when attempting to identify those of Adelaide's higher classes in society who attended prostitutes. However, one particular piece of evidence given by a policeman, Mr. Anthony Everidge, before the Select Committee on the Police Force in 1867, can be regarded as especially relevant here. The question put to him: do you know the people who go there? Answer: I know a good many that ought not to go. Is it part of your duty to report who goes there? No, if I reported some that go there, I do not think I should get any thanks for it. Did you ever see a justice of the peace going there? Yes, I have, and in the Tivoli pulling prostitutes about, and at the theatre drunk and pulling prostitutes about. I could name one that I have seen more than once. Perhaps, however, the most commonly referred to client, especially in the period up to around the turn of the century, was the bushman. They were commonly depicted as rather unsuspecting and even simple men who became the exploited victims of prostitutes and their associates. Although in rural South Australia there does seem to have been a significantly higher percentage of unmarried males than of unmarried females, a situation which was in relative contrast to the metropolitan position, it does not seem legitimate to view the bushman as the most common or even typical client of the prostitute, despite the number of references implying such an assumption. This stereotype may perhaps be viewed in terms of the fact that among the clients of the prostitutes, bushmen were more readily identifiable as a group, one moreover which was, as it were, removed from the lifestyles of those who addressed themselves to writing on this topic in their own time. Other groups who were similarly referred to as frequenters of the prostitutes in South Australia were the overlanders, both gentle and simple, and sailors smuggling, whoring and getting drunk. They're quotes from a reference from Pike. Evidence pertaining to those who resided within the city and suburban areas of Adelaide, and who without doubt must have comprised a considerable proportion of the prostitutes' clientele, are rather more fragmentary. In a general way, mention was made to the lower class of labourers who visited hotels used by the lower class of prostitutes, often residing in the same area. C.W. Chandler, writing in 1907, points also to there being, quote, a large clientele amongst clerks in offices. More specifically, it is possible to establish some kind of insight into the background of a number of the men employing the services of prostitutes in Adelaide through the use of police files. For in certain instances where the police were either brought in to investigate a disturbance in a brothel or entered a prostitute's lodgings on their own initiative, reference was made to the clients found on these premises, who often themselves yielded information concerning the women involved. On one such occasion, John McC. And Patrick N. were found visiting a fairly low-class brothel in Rosina Street in the city. Just as an example, their places of residence and their occupations were given in this case, being respectively labourer living at Brompton and musician and step dancer living in Hindley Street. Strange occupation. This kind of evidence may, at least to some degree, tend to refute the notion of those attending prostitutes as being members invariably of a particular group in South Australian society. One equally important area in examining and analysing prostitution in South Australia is that of child prostitution. Both the press and the police allude to a large number of young girls leading immoral lives. However, especially the police place great emphasis on the notion that, quote, brothel keepers as a rule are afraid to keep girls who are underage, as they know that the police keep a strict surveillance on all houses of ill fame. In at least one clear case, however, an underage prostitute was discovered by the police in an Adelaide brothel and recorded in their files. In 1893, Annie L., quote, a little girl in short clothes, was found residing in a brothel in Hindley Street. Claiming to be 16 years, she did not appear to be more than 14 or 15 years. It is in some of the records of the admissions to the industrial and reformatory schools that it is possible to discern not merely references to young children, both male and female, being found living with their mothers in a brothel, but quite clear recordings of underage girls residing in brothels as prostitutes. Further evidence can also be deduced from the reports of the State Children's Council. Together, these two sets of records stand in almost direct contrast to the claims and assurances made by the police authorities as to the negligible existence of child prostitution in Adelaide brothels during this period. In looking at the admissions to the industrial and girls' reformatory schools between 1863 to 77 and 1871 to 82 respectively, it is clear that in terms of birthplace and religion, 54.5% of these girls were Irish Roman Catholics. Especially when considered in the light of the ratios of the number of Irish to the rest of the population in South Australia, this group stands out as the most highly represented category in this regard during these years. In looking at the age groups of the girls committed here as prostitutes, the greatest proportion appears to lie within the 13 to 16 years bracket. The youngest clear conviction in this group of figures is that of a 10-year-old Honora Kay, sent there in 1882 for 8 years. A number of cases testify to the existence of venereal disease among child prostitutes in Adelaide. Some cases give an insight into the kind of response which the enforced treatment in hospital seems to have engendered in girls convicted for prostitution and found to be suffering from VD. One such, Elizabeth R., aged 16 years and removed from the reformatory to the hospital with venereal disease, absconded along with Annie D., also 16 years of age, after spending only 12 days in the hospital. Arrested by the police on April 26 in 1882, the day following their escape, these girls were readmitted to the reformatory while under treatment. Some 2.5 months later, these girls are further sentenced to jail for 3 months for quote, damaging government property. Such actions of petty violence and aggression seem to have been fairly common modes of resistance for a number of those sent to the reformatory school as underage prostitutes. The case of Jane T., a 15-year-old girl sentenced to the reformatory in 1880 for residing in a brothel in Adelaide, testifies to a harsher form of punishment administered not uncommonly to some of these child prostitutes who reacted in a hostile way to their confined situation. Having damaged government property in June 1880, a month after her admission to the reformatory, she was jailed for 3 months with the stipulation, this time, of hard labour. Her case is significant in at least 2 other respects. Firstly, it demonstrates the possibility of linking the records of 2 different sets of evidence, the industrial and reformatory school admission registers and the police files. The result being that the lives of a number of individual prostitutes can be traced over long periods of time and supplemented with a more detailed and accurate depiction of their past emerging. Thus, in 1892, 12 years after her dismissal from the reformatory, Jane T. is mentioned in the police files as a prostitute occupying a house in the same block as 3 houses where 5 other prostitutes resided in the city. In this particular instance, and this alludes to the second point in her case, Jane T. is recorded as having taken out a warrant for the arrest of Kate T. and Margaret O., 2 of the prostitutes residing in her block, for a recent assault on her person. Thus, this ability to resort to the procedures and processes of the legal system on the part of a woman well known, at least to the police, as a prostitute, is surely an example of a prostitute who cannot be regarded as having conformed to the image so often employed by those writing on these women at the time and in later periods of the silent, defenceless and outcast victims of their society. Again, using this kind of record linkage, it is also possible to make some tentative statements concerning the age structure of the prostitutes in South Australia during this period. As a corollary of this, some picture may be seen to emerge of the degree to which these women became professional prostitutes. By that I mean they remained prostitutes for an extended period of their lives and it brought in the majority of their weekly earnings. Although numbers of young girls and women were recognised by both police and public as indulging in prostitution on a part-time basis, it is also possible to discern a number of those recorded as known prostitutes as women who remained within the occupation for a considerable proportion of their lives. One example of this can be seen in the tracing of the life of Augusta or Gussie G. Just in brief outline, her life goes, as far as I can gather, something like this. In 1871, she was 12 years of age and found living in a brothel. She was sentenced to the industrial school and then to the reformatory school for 2 years. By 1895, some 24 years later, the police reported her as a well-known prostitute in a group of cottages in Hindley Street. Then, by 1904, a further 9 years later, her name appears in a series of police lists of known prostitutes as an occupier of a brothel in Grote Street. Thus, at the age of about 45 years, Gussie G had been involved in prostitution for a period of at least 33 years, from a child aged 12 to a woman in her mid-40s. It was the prostitution of, in particular, young girls that was for a number of people inseparably aligned with the alleged traffic in white slavery mentioned from time to time in South Australia as elsewhere during this period. Contemporary opinions as to the actual practice of white slavery in South Australia seem to have varied considerably. Some totally dismissed the concept as simply a myth. Others were ready to admit instances of young girls being procured, but not an organised traffic in South Australian girls and women. There does exist evidence testifying to at least some cases of women having been the victims of this kind of exploitation. One such, occurring in 1878, involved two prostitutes, Millie W. and a girl named Nellie, who were taken to India by two Afghans. Despite the fact that these two girls do not seem to conform to the stereotype of the young innocent forcibly abducted and seduced, nevertheless elements of extortion and unexpected harsh treatment certainly seem to have been involved. Millie W. in particular complained of, quote, the brutal way in which she was treated and being hired out to other Afghans by the one that took her away. Moreover, apparently other European girls and women were taken to India in a similar way from South Australia at various times during this period. Another practice which can be seen as being linked with prostitution in South Australia is that of baby farming. Baby farmers were persons to whom unwanted and as a rule illegitimate children could be handed over or farmed out, ostensibly to ensure them a good home. The mother usually either made a single payment of money or guaranteed a series of regular instalments, most often with the understanding that no more would be heard of the child. It may be inferred that at least some prostitutes may have availed themselves and their children of such services. Of course, such transactions often meant that the child was inconspicuously allowed to die by the baby farmer, through neglect or cruelty or combination of these. As in the case of white slavery, it is difficult to gauge the actual extent to which baby farming was practiced in South Australia, especially in the light of the problems involved in gaining a conviction against such persons. The State Children's Council does refer to the existence of the practice, as well as to the need to legislate so as to guard against its future occurrence in South Australia. That's in the late 1890s. Actual cases of convictions for baby farming can be found in the police files for this period. One example was the case of Mrs. Emily H., a middle-aged woman residing in Semaphore and married to the local town clerk and sanitary inspector. Numerous testimonies were given against her which left little doubt as to her neglect and ill usage of the children under her charge. Cases like hers may well be viewed as giving insights into the character, if not to the actual extent, of baby farming in South Australia during this period. The occurrence of theft and prostitution was also often linked in reports concerned with prostitutes in South Australia. Nevertheless, the Police Commissioner in 1851 viewed Adelaide brothels, at least at this time, as being generally, quote, as well conducted as houses of this description usually are. Persons indiscreet enough to frequent them with large sums of money and in a state of intoxication can hardly feel surprised if when sober they discover they have been robbed. Certainly, prostitutes, which indicates their lack of sympathy for such cases. Certainly, prostitutes were often noted to be living and or acting in collusion with thieves, larrikins and loafers. The existence of this latter class of loafers, or pimps or bludgers, as they were commonly called in South Australia during this period, living on prostitution, was often alluded to in the newspapers. However, it is from police files in particular that the actual existence of this kind of relationship between prostitutes and other men would appear to be most reliably obtained. Findings in this regard in Adelaide seem to affirm the presence of kept men of this kind. Some of these men were known by the police in a similar way as a number of prostitutes, and moreover for a span of some years. Thus the police declared of William C., husband of a well-known prostitute, Edith R., that, quote, if he is working now, it is about the first time in the last 5 years. It was to these men that the venom of the public was so often directed. And now I move on to the public response and the attitudes towards reform. Perhaps the most commonly expressed sentiment regarding prostitution in South Australia was that it could never be abolished. Individual statements or complaints accepted its presence, some explicitly, others implicitly, as constituting one of those necessary evils involved in, quite specifically, man's existence. Until men are changed, declared one reporter in 1879, I know it cannot be entirely removed. Thus, as Hall and Howes pointed out in a study, The Church in Social Work a study of moral welfare work undertaken by the Church of England in 1965. That's in Britain. In looking at parallel attitudes around this time in England, quote, the prostitution of a number of women in order to satisfy the sexual demands of men was in general looked upon as an inevitable part of the social order. Also in this attitude can be seen what Bernard Shaw, writing in 1902, referred to as, quote, the widely whispered view that prostitution, is an indispensable safety valve for the protection of domestic virtue. It was the public nuisances and outwardly offensive behaviour so often accompanying the practice of prostitution which were most commonly vilified rather than the act of prostitution itself, which was not, after all, normally made visible to the eyes of the public. Thus, for example, in interviewing some of the residents who had complained of a nearby brothel, a police constable in 1892 found that they all state that they are not annoyed in any way except by an occasional cab stopping outside their residence. Considerable concern was also expressed in relation to the decreases in financial value of certain property holdings in areas where brothels tended to be concentrated. Clearly, this emanated from interests on the part of the complainants for their own welfare, in this case of an economic nature, rather than once again from any real objection to the character of the act which was the cause of their concern, that is, to prostitution itself. The notion that prostitution constituted a necessary evil in society must be seen to have conditioned the kinds of responses and measures suggested by citizens to deal with this problem. One common suggestion was that the kind of public houses and brothels where prostitutes resorted should be relegated to the more obscure portions of the city. This gave rise very often to the sentiment expressed by a member of a deputation to the Premier of South Australia in 1905 over the social evils in West Adelaide. Quote, we have had them for so long, let someone else have them for 12 months. This demand, when unfulfilled, gave way in a number of instances to a call for an increase in the numbers of police to parade areas of this kind in an attempt to attain at least a semblance of public order. Whilst only a few colonists took the view that clients of prostitutes should be prosecuted or at least exposed to the public eye, a far more prevalent attitude was that it was those living on the earnings of prostitution, the bludgers, who were most deserving of punishment. These men, like those who procured girls to work in the brothels, were decried as the initiators of a large extent of prostitution in the colony. In this way, then, attention was drawn away from the client as the one who created a demand for prostitution and focused instead on those who were involved in the creation of its supply. Such perception of the prostitute as a victim can also be regarded as opening the way towards a concern for the welfare of these women. Attempts were made throughout this period to include the care and reform of the prostitute within the gamut of the welfare and rescue work carried out in South Australia. In attempting to assess this public response to the prostitution problem, it is necessary to examine some of these works as part of the total response. I'll just mention a few of these briefly. In the 1850s, the Destitute Asylum, as Brian's mentioned, admitted some diseased prostitutes and unmarried mothers, but usually rather reluctantly. And around the 1850s, the Adelaide City Mission also included fallen women in its general work. And in 1856, the South Australian Female Refuge at Norwood was founded by the Anglican Church in Adelaide. On the whole, this was regarded as rather unsuccessful. For instance, 8 were admitted in 1859, and only 3 of those 8 were reclaimed to the point where they could obtain respectable work as domestic servants. Apparently having a greater degree of success, however that's gauged, was the Catholic Refuge established in 1868 under the care of the Sisters of St. Joseph. The principal aim of this refuge was stated as being that of, quote, lessening the suffering of womanhood and to shelter the newborn. In pursuing this hope, no limits were placed either upon the creed or purse or class of those desirous of shelter, nor on their length of stay, and that was unusual with some, because they prescribed that they had to leave within a couple of weeks after having the child. By 1876, the sisters were reported to have received for help 203 women. Of these, 65 had returned to friends, 54 were said to have obtained employment, 10 were sent to hospital, 12 refused to remain, 20 absconded, and 7, quote, died penitent. And 12 were sent away as incorrigible, and 4 were taken to the Destitute Asylum, and 12 went back to prostitution. If you're wondering, the other 17 remained in the refuge. Further, between 1886 and 1902, a total of 1,274 women and 507 children were recorded as having been registered and sheltered at this refuge. Another organisation was the WCTU, founded in Adelaide in 1886. Aside from its agitation for legislation to protect women's purity, it was also known for its work of rescue in, for example, the jails and public houses. Lastly, the Salvation Army maintained a women's shelter in Fenn Place, just off Hindley Street in the city. By 1914, this could accommodate 7 women at a time. Whilst this kind of night refuge can be seen as providing only a temporary form of aid to these women, it on the other hand differed from the majority of the long-stay rescue homes, located very often in the suburbs of Adelaide, in that it offered at least practical help in close proximity to those areas where prostitution was known to exist. On the whole, then, it would appear that the reform and rescue work undertaken in South Australia during this period was initiated, like its counterpart in Britain, on a religious basis, quote, for the love of God and activated by belief in the eternal worth of each human soul. Nevertheless, the work of prevention, at least in terms of challenging the social and economic conditions which seem to have promoted a continuance of the extent of prostitution in South Australia, was clearly given considerably less prominence than that of rescue. All the same, such work must surely be viewed in the context of what appears to have been a prevailing belief in prostitution as a necessary part of the social order. Moreover, it may well be that the moral reform workers of that time felt, some less consciously than others, that the work of prevention was not so much their specific concern, rather it was the concern of the whole society. And there's not too much to go on the laws and enforcement. Throughout the period of 1836 to 1914, the laws relating to prostitution in South Australia seem to have been aimed at suppressing primarily the outward or public manifestations of the soliciting prostitute. In a strict sense, the act of prostitution was not in itself condemned by law. Implicit in such a situation in the notion of prostitution being an act which cannot be ultimately abolished in any society. Thus it is, as it were, ignored by a law which concentrated instead on attempting to ensure that it existed in private, being at least ostensibly hidden from public view. In this two-pronged focus of attention, parallels can be clearly seen as existing between the laws in South Australia pertaining to prostitution and the attitudes of the general public during this period. In addition to applying the actual laws regarding prostitution, the police made use of plainclothes constables to keep a close watch on both the individual prostitutes in the streets as well as on the houses known to be occupied by them. In what can be seen as a response to the prevailing interests of both their society and the laws of that society, the police in practice were essentially concerned to maintain outward order in the community. As a direct corollary of this concern, the police accepted a situation in which prostitutes residing in Adelaide were seen to be confined to certain well-known streets. Replying to a deputation of residents and property owners of West Adelaide protesting against the concentration of social evils in their district, the Premier in 1905 voiced the position rather succinctly. The police liked to have a place in every city where they could lay their hands on the people they wanted. A vigorous attack on these people would mean that they would be spread over the whole community. This might sound a bit like the arguments of today. The evil did exist everywhere, and no good could come from shifting people from one part of the city to another. Individual instances of prostitutes who are, at least in practice, accepted by the police authorities are not uncommon. Other cases point to the ways in which the police seem to have reacted differently to individual prostitutes, perhaps most frequently according to their perceptions of the varying characters and past patterns of behaviour of these women. Just comparing two, Edith R. and Florence E. were described as of a very quarrelsome disposition, and looking at their backgrounds, they had a long list of offences including larceny, indecent language and brothel keeping, whereas Margaret J., though recognised as a known prostitute, was said to be one who kept her house in a most quiet manner, and looking at her background, she was described as having no previous convictions, and unlike Edith and Florence, who resided with a well-known bludger, she lived alone and temporarily, quote, with her little boy about 5 years of age, with her on account of him being very ill and requires his mother's attention. It was not until 1907 that legislation was passed which dealt specifically with the suppression of brothels in South Australia. The principal object of this act was to punish the persons responsible for their maintenance. Any attempt to assess the success of such a law will here undoubtedly be both tentative as well as problematic. Nevertheless, at least in general terms, in looking at the police files following its enactment in 1907, the Suppression of Brothels Act would not seem to have fulfilled the expectations of those responsible for its proposal. More specifically, by the end of this period and the advance of the First World War, a number of adverse comments regarding there being any real change or lessening of the extent of prostitution in South Australia as a result of this act had begun to appear. Prostitutes during this period were generally regarded as the central agents of infection by venereal disease in the society. For many, therefore, the unregulated prostitute was not only offensive in terms of the public morality of their society, but even more so a dangerous menace to public health. An integral part of the concern over venereal disease was its effects on both the children born after such a disease was contracted, as well as the contamination of the wives of those men who visited the houses of prostitutes. Such sympathy was usually expressed in terms of their suffering rather than that of the prostitutes themselves. As a corollary of these attitudes too, a number of people in this period came to suggest and debate the possibility of licensing and regulating prostitution through registration and the inspection of prostitutes for venereal disease in South Australia. In 1867, this notion was to be of central concern in the reports made as a result of a move by Strangways in the House of Assembly as to the best means of lessening the evils of prostitution. Reports came from 6 people: the colonial surgeon, the police magistrate, commissioner of police, chief inspector of police, inspector of metropolitan police, and the chairman of the Destitute Board. Every one of these reports, excepting that of the chairman of the Destitute Board, advocated the introduction in South Australia of a system involving the registration and compulsory periodic medical inspection of individual prostitutes. Needless to say, Contagious Diseases Act weren't introduced here. In terms of the actual operation of this system, it was suggested that, as in many respects in the situation where the Contagious Diseases Act had been applied in Britain, quote, any known prostitute, such as had been convicted of the offence before a magistrate, should be registered and compelled to submit to a weekly or bi-weekly medical examination under pain of imprisonment for refusal. If found diseased, they should be sent to a lock hospital. Only the chairman of the Destitute Board at this time rejected totally the notion of implementing any kind of licensing system, agreeing with the suggestions of both the Commissioner of the Police and the Inspector of Police that the law should also be extended to include the punishment of clients employing the services of the prostitute. He pointed out that he viewed it to be a great injustice to legislate entirely against the woman. If an absolute exemption is to be made of the man, it is then all on one side. In this way, he can be regarded as alluding to the abolition of the double standard of morals in society, which was similarly called for by those like Josephine Butler, who argued against the operation of Contagious Diseases Acts in Britain, focusing upon the degradation which the system of licensing and compulsory medical inspection was seen to impose on the prostitutes. They, quote, found it intolerable that women should be debauched for men's satisfaction and then treated as the offenders. Similarly, his report decried, that's the chairman of the Destitute Board, decried the stigma which attached to the women who were working as prostitutes upon her becoming, as it were, a public figure through the use of the registration process. Nevertheless, in denouncing the proposals for such a system, the chairman of the Destitute Board must be regarded as having for his focus the function as some sort of venereal and regulation of prostitution seemed to gather impetus on a number of occasions throughout the period, in particular when discussion arose concerning the extent of prostitution in South Australia. It was with the coming of the First World War, and so too the problem of the infection of troops with venereal diseases, that still further stimulus was added to the general debate over the legalisation of prostitution in the community. Once again, there were those who lent support to the notion of licensing and controlling the prostitute and her trade, whilst others, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, explicitly rejected both this proposal as well as the compulsory medical examinations of prostitutes, which were seen to be an integral part of the registration process. Finally then, the period 1836 to 1914 can be seen to conclude in a debate which was somehow characteristic of this period, arising as it did throughout these years and beyond. Further, it was a debate which seemed to echo the failure of the founders and their successors to come to any real solution to the problem, as they saw it, of prostitution in South Australia.
So is there any medical cure for VD in those early years?
They use They used several, most of which didn't cure. The common one was mercury, which doesn't really do much for the body. And was there an actual cure though?
Well, mercury was a long-term suppressant, wasn't it? It was
Yes,
a long-term course that, given abstinence, I think balanced out the condition.
Yes, one
If you
night of
didn't-
Venus and the rest of your life with mercury.
I think that's it.
Joan had to come up with that, didn't she? She's been waiting for that all this time. You've waited an hour for that one.
And that's of course, that's what a lock hospital was, by the way. The lock hospital was where women were kept under compulsion while they were subject to this long-term, very painful treatment.
But the prostitutes, I think, anyhow, didn't go, as far as I can gather, to lock hospitals or to any help until they were fairly well advanced in the stages of venereal disease.
This would be syphilis?
Yes.
There never was a lock hospital in South Australia.
No, I mean, just the section of the hospital that was not used.
So have you done any research into male prostitution?
I didn't come across any, I must admit. I suspect, looking at the British situation, I suspect that it was a small proportion then, say in London. Do you mean males for males, by the way?
Just males or anybody?
Yeah, I think it probably wouldn't have had. There wouldn't have been much enough to sustain it in Adelaide. Anyhow, I mean, I think there probably would have been more likely homosexual cohabitation rather than need for prostitution. I don't know. It's hard to gauge from the records.
So how much time and effort did the police put into, observing houses of ill repute and so on? Did they spend all their time just putting on plain clothes and stuff?
I think there were some streets had them there at certain hours every day, just not suppressing them, just making sure that they weren't on the streets, basically. It was all right as long as they weren't seen. Seems to me.
Just round the corner from the police headquarters.
The map is interesting. You may well wish to check up on the status of certain streets of Adelaide in the night.
They were the most commonly that's taken from the most commonly reported brothels, just lists of them from the complaints.
So I was wondering what the mode of advertising was. I haven't
Oh, you have got some examples. There's the notice in the door about dressmaking taken in.
Oh yes, that sort of There's quite a few confectioners' shops and dressmakers' shops were traditionally seemed to be prostitutes. And
Prostituting wasn't a euphemism for...
Pardon? I didn't catch that one. I missed out something dreadful.
Carry on.
I didn't hear it last. I'll get you. That sort of thing. Also I was just thinking of the advertisements for baby farming. I came across, like the woman that I mentioned for baby farming, they could advertise in the paper. Things like, willing to take child in, no questions asked. That sort of thing gave an indication. Yeah.
Tony first, I think, and then John.
Cases of famous South Australians being found in and if so, who were they?
I think I think Peter Howell knows of a few of those. He's better on famous South Australians.
former president.
Charlie Cameron Kingston died of syphilis. I
That's
think
right, that's
that's
the
the
Kingston
public
one.
example. But whether that was the product of paying for it or not, we don't know. But whether there are any other 19th century famous names other than the obvious JP that policeman was referring to.
Oh, from those.
Prostitutes per head, the number of men per prostitute. Given that this group of the Bushmen was at least of some significance, then I presume that really Adelaide prostitutes have to be balanced up against the male population of the state pretty much. Do they? At least perhaps all but the stable rural population which didn't move about.
Yes, I noticed that in certain periods, farmers would come down like for exhibitions and things like that.
Selling
Usually at those periods, though, interstate prostitutes would move in as well, which might help balance it out. But even if it was half that, it would still be fairly high.
I thought perhaps the gentlemen of Norwood, Horan, Martin, Adelaide would be a little, given a little too much responsibility for that.
Oh no, Adelaide generally.
Brian, you wanted to make a point.
The traditional association of prostitution with theatres, the Was that common throughout the period, or did it start? When did it start to change? If it
It seems to be common throughout the period. I don't think it changed even into the early 20th century. It's there. Different hotels were identified with different types of prostitutes on the social strata.
Over there and then over here.
Was there any deliberate attempt on the part of the police to control prostitutes by arrest? For instance, in Sydney, a study has found that the deliberate policy of the police was to arrest older prostitutes in order to open the assembly line for younger girls, because they made more profit. In other words, that the police openly collaborated in promoting prostitution, not just limiting it.
I haven't come across any.
I mean, you're not going to find it in police files or something.
No, just thinking of the lists of known brothel keepers that they kept. Their comments about the older ones, the brothel owners, if they kept the house well, quietly, they didn't seem to. They seemed to be more tolerant of the older ones who'd been in the business longer, as it were. That's why they made such a thing about clamping down on young girls and child prostitution. That's why I presume that's why they keep appearing so often in the industrial school records, even though the police say that they weren't there. They were obviously being taken in.
Might be worth explaining. I think Sue, it might be worth explaining that under the Destitute Act of 1867, 72 and 83, one of the categories that permitted a child to be taken into care was if the child was under the appropriate age, was living in a brothel, and that gave the court power to regulate the life of the child up to the girls up to the age of 18. It wasn't an offence, and yet, of course, they weren't guilty of anything, but of course they were subject to what we now call grave moral danger, and that gave the state gave the power to the State Children's Council of Destitute Asylum to take them into the industrial school, or if they committed an offence, they then became subject to the reformatory school, didn't they?
Yes, well, that's one indication whether they were residing in a brothel with just residing there, and their age helped me to determine that, or whether they were actually practising prostitution within the brothel.
Well,
they usually remained in the industrial school, and if they were residing in a brothel for the purposes of prostitution, then they were sent to the reformatory school immediately afterwards.
They'd have to have committed an offence. They'd have to have broken the law. So it wasn't...
These girls went into the industrial school and then they were sent to the reformatory school.
Yes, but they could only be sent to the reformatory school if they could be convicted of things like thieving or...
residing in a brothel for the purposes of prostitution. They were sent there for that.
You better check on it.
I wonder whether, well, certainly at a considerably later date, there was discretion on the part of the head of the industrial school as to whether a child was suitable
that
to
could
be
be
kept
it.
or not.
Oh, that's a separate issue.
It's possible that the child, as Sue said, they went first to the industrial school and then was judged to be unfit for the industrial school and was sent on to the
that's what I meant.
Without being charged.
That's a further problem.
That's what I think what I meant, yeah.
There was a problem of internal discipline, and up to 1887 that was illegal but done. This business of having riots damaging property, they'll dance naked on the roof, burnt the mattresses.
Sounds like Warnhouse.
Well, that's what Warnhouse was. Still is.
So there's a number of scattered references to men selling their wives, especially in the early period. Did that sort of crop up in any of the police files?
That didn't come up in the files, in the police files, no. Not the ones I went through. But I think they seemed to come up in the newspapers more, didn't it?
You sort of see them sometimes in newspapers.
That's where I've come across it.
Public auction.
You mean the public auction, didn't you?
Public auction of their wives?
Yes,
The
yes,
baron.
getting up in the pub with a halter around her waist and selling her off for a high figure.
It came through in the newspapers that you've pointed out to me too.
Helen first, and then...
What, during this period, was the age of consent?
Ah.
Was it altered and when?
I had that there. I was almost going to interrupt and give it to you. It changed almost identically with the changes in Britain too. I'll get there. Yes. In 1837 it was 10. In 1876 it was 12, and then as it changed in 1885 in England it became 16 by 1885. Did I go too far?
It remained as that.
16, yes. Well, for the period I'm here.
Exactly, that was my question of the age of consent, is that until quite late in the 19th century it was 16 years old, and now of course there's a move to reduce it back to 13, because most girls started to course at 13 now. They mature much earlier because we all eat much better as a child. The other thing I mentioned is that the other industrial problem for prostitutes is pregnancy, and abortifacients were easily available. You could go to any sort of pharmacy up to about 1902 and buy an abortifacient very cheaply. It's only when the birth rate really dropped that our dear governors decided that women couldn't control how many children they could have.
Yes.
What was the suffragettes' attitude towards prostitution? Didn't they have a policy?
The suffragettes within the WCTU, the ones that were interested there too, seem to have regarded it as I think it's a bit hard to give a clear statement of how they seem. They don't come out with it very much, but they seem to have regarded it as unfair exploitation of women or something like along that. They wouldn't have put it as strongly as that, but that's why they came out so strongly against the introduction of the registration process, as following along like Josephine Butler and co in Britain, I presume.
I think we might take a break at that point. Thank you, Sue, very much for the appointment. Sorry, Brian, you had one. Do you want one last question?
No, those notices.
Oh yes, Brian Samuel has a notice, and we'll take. Thank you, Sue, very much.